record. So I think we're recording now. Yeah, we can go ahead and get started. So hello and welcome to the first ever Black History Month event in the Department of Entomology at Texas A&M. My name is Morgan Thompson, and I am the graduate student representative for the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee in the Department of Entomology. Today, I have the distinct honor of introducing our panelists and moderating this panel discussion alongside my colleague and fellow graduate student, Jaclyn Martin. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Jessica Ware, who is the Assistant Curator of Odonata and non-holometabolous minor orders at the American Museum of Natural History. She also serves as the Principal Investigator at the Sackler Institute for Comparative Genomics and is an Assistant Professor at the Richard Gleider Graduate School. Next, we are joined by Dr. Alexandra Harmon-Threet, who is an Associate Professor of Entomology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. We are also joined by Dr. Alvin Simmons, who is a research entomologist with the USDA in the Agricultural Research Service section. And finally, Dr. Jared Ali, who is an Assistant Professor of Entomology at Penn State University. Thank you all so much for joining us today and agreeing to share your insights and experiences with us all. For the audience, I would like to take a moment to share that the goal of this panel discussion is to highlight the accomplishments of Black entomologists and also to explore different experiences and challenges the panelists have faced throughout their careers. We would like for participants today to come away with new insights and perspectives to promote equity and fight injustice in our department and beyond, which is a common goal that unites us all. To do this, we want to remind participants to respect the panelists and what they choose to share with us today. Some of the topics discussed today may be challenging, but these dialogues are necessary. As entomologists, we need to be aware of injustices and challenges that affect our peers and colleagues so that we can foster a more welcoming and inclusive field for Black entomologists. Therefore, we ask you all to listen, keep an open mind, and learn from today. With that, I would like to begin by stating, if any participant has a question during the discussion, please type your question in the chat box, and Jaclyn or I will read the question to the panelists. We would also ask for all participants to please keep your videos off. So if folks with videos on right now maybe just want to go ahead and shut those off so we can see the panelists, highlight them. And we would also ask you all to remain muted for the discussion. And in this way, we will facilitate an engaging and respectful dialogue between panelists and participants. So with that, my first question to you all would be, how did you become interested in entomology? Anyone can go ahead, start.
I would take the start, if I may. Yeah, and first of all, thanks for the invitation to be able to join this distinguished panel and this exciting event. For me, having grown up on a small farm in New Bern, North Carolina, the world outside was a playground of science. Not only the field crops, the aquatic environments, the woodland, day or night, science would just abound. And it's just that for insects, of course, as the behavior components and the curiosity of the biological activities that I can see right in front of me, that was my start of interest in entomology.
I can take a stab. Yeah, bugs for me weren't like for many of us, the first thing I noticed when I walked out the door, and they were often out of sight and out of mind for me. I did have a tendency to mess with a lot of creatures I found crawling around the outside of my house, doing kind of would be potentially freaky things with them, making experiments, putting them in sinks, putting all types of soaps and whatever I could find under the sink, and kind of torturing bugs, so to say. So it kind of fits with a lot of the things we still do with insects in my laboratory to this date. A lot of insect torture does take place. But for me, it wasn't, I was in a biology major as an undergraduate. And when looking for laboratories to join, outside of more of the cell-based cell culture, cell studies that were prominent in the biology department at my university, I really was gravitated towards something that was more organismal, and that I could actually see an animal, work with plants, all of my stereotypical concepts of scientists out in the underbrush, sniffing plants and touching organisms. It seemed more like what I wanted to be. So through an undergraduate opportunity in research lab with actually Douglas TAMU at University of Delaware, I got attracted for an undergraduate project, realized how unique they were. And the second I saw an insect for what they were and took my first entomology class, I was overwhelmed with how ubiquitous they were and how underappreciated they are. They're super accessible everywhere you are. And that kind of took me off. I stayed on with Doug TAMU for my master's and continued to look at the different ways insects interact with other organisms.
I'll jump in just because my story is pretty similar to yours. I actually grew up in Chicago, so I was a city kid. And although I actually was pretty outdoorsy, my family still likes to camp and hike and stuff. I didn't really think that much about insects. And I was at a pre-med dominant university as an undergrad, and I was just really miserable. And there was a literal sign on the wall that's like, do you like being outside? Do you want to do ecology research for the summer? And I was like, yes, that sounds awesome. And started out working on a pollination project, but on a plant side. And after you stare at flowers for a really long time, you get very interested in the insects, right? Like when I'm sitting there with a timer, watching them come and go, and I was like, but where did it go? Like, why did it leave? Why is it going somewhere else? And then went to graduate school. I switched to studying insects because I just really wanted to know more about them. And I've been kind of, using a lot of the same methods, but sitting and, timing insects coming to flowers, looking at the insects much more closely than I was at that point. And it's been quite a joy for me.
I guess I could chime in and say that I grew up in the city as well, I suppose, in Toronto. We spent a lot of our time up north in Northern Ontario in Canada. And my twin and I hate to say this, Jared, because I would not have said we were torturing, but we did experiments many, many times, not just with insects, but we did a lot of experiments outside because we did a lot of nature walks with my nan, and we collect things and bring them back and study them. But I actually was going to go into marine biology. And then when I was at university at UBC, then I got kind of turned on to entomology because I was taking so much invert zoo. And I didn't know anybody who had really gone on to university and gone on to a science career. So I'm really, ever grateful that the folks at UBC kind of said, hey, there's a thing called grad school and you can actually do entomology for a job, because that was not really in my, I didn't know that existed, so.
Awesome. So who are the people and mentors that helped shape and develop your entomological interests?
I don't know, should I just jump in to continue? I don't know if this is to follow the thought, but I would just say that, when I was at UBC, I had a person who was the instructor of the lab, Karen Needham. And then I had TAs. I think we kind of underestimate, as a TA, when people are TAs, you kind of underestimate the impact that you might have on a student. But if not for my TAs kind of telling me that they were in graduate school and that graduate school was a thing, and Karen Needham kind of telling me about work study and offering me a job, then I think I probably wouldn't have gotten into it. And then I was fortunate enough that Diane Shrivastava she was a postdoc and she had a research associate position, and she hired me and then really became a mentor. I'd never really had someone who was a true mentor, and she really kind of guided me. These are the steps you need to take. This is how you apply to grad school. You had to take the GRE, and it was very helpful.
So I started out working with Tiffany Knight, who was a botanist. And, similar to what Jessica was saying, I didn't really know that I could, even though I was working really directly with her, because at that point she was so new that she didn't really have any graduate students. It was like just she and I. And she's like, well, you're really good at this. Like you could go to graduate school. And I was like, but what would I do? Like it didn't, I'm working with a professor and it just didn't occur to me like that was like a job that I could have, that I could be a professor like she was a professor. She's like, well, you could be a professor. And I was like, that's weird. No. And but she really encouraged me. She's like, there just really aren't that many Black ecologists. And you would be, one of very few. And for me, that was actually very appealing. I think that could be super intimidating for some people, but for me, I was like, I really love this. And, it'd be kind of fun to be able to, for people to see me and say like, oh, that's something I could do, because I had never seen myself doing it, as being in that role. So it was really fun for me.
I would say it started really with my parents growing up on the farm, because fortunately for us that we use very little pesticide in controlling the insects, the pests. And we had quite valuable recognizing the pollinators, which was constantly encountered and respected. Plus also the parasitoids that were helping to kill the insects. Otherwise, it was a lot of hand removing some of the insects in the tobacco, in the home garden. Plus again, the constant rotation of crops. And we knew why we were rotating, not only because of the weeds, but also because of the pest management. But the next step was in high school of my biology teacher, who after each exam, she would go over the exam with each student. And she inspired me by pointing out that she felt that I was gifted in biology. And well, that was a motivation, very important motivation, I feel. And with that motivation, having my undergraduate degree in biology, and although there was no entomology being offered except for every alternate summers, the summer that I applied, my final summer before graduation, it was canceled. Without not enough people. However, before that summer was to begin, there was a spring field trip that 13 students and 3 faculty took all the way up to Southern Ontario. And I was the insect expert. I mean, that was the honor that was given to me by the professors, because they knew of my interest in entomology in the group. Sure, I knew a lot. Perhaps they may have known more, but again, that motivation, encouragement. And of course, from there, taking my first entomology classes, University of Kentucky, of having had 2 outstanding mentors, Bobby Pass and Ken Jurgen, that constantly nurtured me, as everyone else would have been nurtured by their mentors. Not only during the time in graduate school for master's and PhD, but also continued to interact beyond that. So those were priceless experiences.
Yeah, I had a really interesting track in general. Like I dropped out of high school actually, and went on my own quest around the country. I road tripped and took buses across Canada, and then met up with a friend with his plan to go down all the way to Mexico, down the western coast of California. I was going to read books and play music and walk around in the desert and be a free spirit or something. I'm not really sure what my ultimate goal was, but during that trip, my friend, she suggested that we stop in San Diego, and school seemed like the furthest thing from me, but for me at that time, but she mentioned and recommended that it would be great to hang out with her grandfather. Her grandfather would talk to me about what he did. He had this really cool house in California, and he showed me all of it. He had interesting pictures of all these invertebrates around his house. He actually studied krill, and he was a scientist. And I couldn't grasp what you were other than a doctor, being, as many of us do, a doctor is someone that works on humans and is an MD. And I didn't understand. I was like, how did you travel around the world? How did you have a home and build your life by studying these tiny things? So he actually brought me into his lab. He showed me that he worked at Scripps Institution for Oceanography. And he knew I had an interest in science and biology in general, because we would wake up early in the morning and just talk. And he's like, what are you doing out of school? Like, you should go back. And I think this idea, knowing you could kind of be almost a reclusive human and study stuff that other people were overlooking and was out of their, intrigued me, that I could do what I wanted, which I was already driven to do, like by just walking off of my high school campus and going to, no one knew where I was. And so I like the idea, oh, I can explore things that other people aren't exploring. And there's an actual infrastructure for doing that. I can find anything and make anything an interesting story and answer questions people didn't even know they had. And so that kind of motivated me to go back to school. And then, when I reflect upon it, when I got interested in the organismal component of insects, it kind of relates back to meeting Edward Brinton back at Scripps, just because that idea that, oh, you can study these tiny little animals. Although, he was studying krill, I got interested in these tiny bugs, and I realized there was a lot more potency there than I realized. And I think that, in combination with meeting Doug Talmy, who really taught me to appreciate and how to ask really interesting ecological questions, was priceless. And getting a mentor like that was amazing, who believed in me, who fought through all of my deficits or my challenging thing. I think back, I'm like, what was he thinking when he brought me out to the woods? We did these crazy research projects at the Smithsonian, had this island, Plummer's Island. And he would drive down to Washington, D.C., go to an island for 3 nights, counting and clicking bugs, much like Alexandra was mentioning, under plants. And he just stuck with it for me and trained me so much, and was very patient. And, later on, I got back to university, and I was invited back because I won an early career award at University of Delaware. And he just mentioned, he's like, I saw something in you, Jared, that you didn't know. Like, I was like, I never knew I'd become this. I was a dropout, gonna go play guitar and read books. But he really saw a lot in me. And every time I think about my trajectory between those talks with Edward in San Diego and Doug Talmy being a really strong mentor, they were priceless.
Yeah, that's great. And yeah, I completely agree. I feel like when you study insects, it just changes your perspective on the world. When you're studying these little creatures, it just totally changes your mindset. So yeah, that's really great. Yeah, we had an order for questions, but something that you said, Jared, it just kind of leads really nicely into this question. So I'm going off script a little bit, but many of us at some point in our academic career have experienced imposter syndrome, or this, kind of internal experience of believing that you are not as competent as others perceive you to be. And so I guess for you all, what suggestions would you have for someone in combating imposter syndrome? And do you have maybe a personal example that you can share about how you kind of work through that on your own?
I could say, yeah, it's something I'm pretty transparent with my current students or undergraduates that I teach and colleagues, that it's something that's kind of chronically there, because as a scientist, you're super speculative, and you're trained to be a doubter in a lot of ways. That's really what the scientific method is about. And so that self-imposed doubt becomes not only intrinsic, but also like a part of the way you approach the world. That skepticism and then self-skepticism, when you look in the mirror, when you look at your productivity or what you're doing, comes along with it. What I've noticed, though, is a lot of it's about comparisons. And I think the only reason that you have that is because you use other humans as a relative platform to judge your progress. And I say that to the students among my lab. It's like, you're all moving at different paces and different people do different things. And that comparison modality can be toxic, you know, like science is a community based on a commons of people talking and interacting. And when competition can be healthy if it's focused on the systems, but then competition based off of productivity or attributes or other metrics that we'll self-measure against isn't really healthy. And so I just say really attempt to focus on what you're doing and your progress from one step to another, and look back at where you were and realize how far you've come. I have meetings with students where, you know, some days they'll mention to me like, oh, I've done all this, but it's not nothing compared to what this group is doing. And this other group have already found this. I've done this. I was like, do you remember when I first met you and I showed you the GCMS? Do you know how many people could use that gas chromatography machine, get insects, plants, sample volatiles, identify them? How many people can do that on the planet as comfortably and design an assay for that? Think about how far you've come, not about where other people have come and what other work they have to do, because they probably have the same syndrome with different, with a different feature. So I think that's one thing. And I think as you know, as a minority or a person of color in general, it's imposed upon you because it's assumed you don't belong here. And a lot of the predecessors have made it so it was challenging for you to get here. So as part of being a pioneer or a rare individual, whether it's female, whether it's your gender or anything that isn't the standard or status quo, it's imposed that you don't belong there. So there is a kind of extra weight on you as an individual in those contexts. And again, it really is looking at where you came from. There's one problem I kind of noticed though, is when you are these pioneers, it selects for certain mentalities anyway, that like, luckily I'm comfortable kind of being outgoing or don't mind being the only person in the room, or don't mind standing out in a lot of contexts. And so whether I feel an imposter or not, it kind of means that it's self-selected for an individual like that doesn't mind being the only Black person in his department or the only Black faculty in their college. And so that imposter syndrome I have to swallow and deal with every day I wake up. So I feel like mentoring students, it's like, just don't look at other people, focus on what you're doing and do the best you can. And so that's kind of how I've dealt with it and still deal with it on a daily basis.
Okay, I'll go next. A couple of things. One is, as Gerard mentioned about the weight. On the one hand, regardless of who we are, if we have entomology as part of our title, if we have doctor as part of our title, there's a certain expectation of us. One, we're supposed to know everything about entomology. We're supposed to know everything. And of course, in reality, that is not the case. On the one hand, we know that we all have each unique specialties. Some individuals have a broad interest and expertise than others within the discipline. It's okay, of course, to acknowledge what we do not know, and especially when we are interacting with the public, they definitely expect we know everything or should know everything. But to never say more than what we can back up with facts and knowledge, and to admit it if we don't know or how much we can share. Back to the weight, and as such, going through from undergraduate to graduate school with the expectation of going to graduate school, one should know a certain amount. And in my case, unlike most of my classmates, as I mentioned before, I had no formal entomology training, but lots of hands-on training, lots of world book knowledge as I would study about insects, different types of insects. But haven't recognized the fact that for me, having a broad interest in science, I early on realized that I can integrate those different sciences into my entomological interest, which is something many entomologists do. And by having had the expectation, I felt that weight of having to do extra, to make sure that I have that solid knowledge, that solid expertise in when I want to specialize in a particular area, to be extra instead of being what I would have perhaps otherwise. But those are things which actually helped me throughout my career. Although initially it was more of a sort of burden. And I recall starting in my current location, which I've been here since 1992, that my supervisor said, Alvin, if someone asks you to carry a light load, you don't have to carry a whole load of bricks. So in other words, I don't have to do a lot of extra. However, what's important is balance, that one doesn't overdo extra. One reason that I continue to this day do extra is because that excites me, the interest, the challenge. And something in which I do in consulting with undergraduates and others I mentor going through my lab. And I do co-mentor some graduate students with different universities in my laboratory, plus some summer interns. I remind them to focus on primarily what interests them and to not overextend yourself. However, to do extend yourself, that's how one get the extra experiences. That's when continue to go beyond just the narrow road.
I could jump in and say, I really identify with what Jared and Alvin are saying. I think for years, I really felt like at the position I was in previously, I was had to try and be a model, to be a spokesperson for all Black scientists, since there was only 2 Black scientists in the whole campus, and the other one was in another department. And so people, I felt like, were holding me up to this meter stick that I had to, kind of constantly produce not to let down an entire group of people. And so it can be helpful to have someone, in my case, my best friend Ann Nielsen and my twin are kind of constant sounding boards. They can say, hey, I think, get over yourself. You don't actually have to represent everybody. Just do your dragonfly work. And that can be really helpful. But then they also can be there to sometimes asking someone else to write down your accomplishments and then give it to you. That can be really useful because you may not see it yourself. Even if you take time and try and look at how far you've come, you may not be able to see it for a variety of reasons. And so somebody else who's an observer can often, acknowledge the things that you may not be able to see. And so sometimes, in some of the mentoring circles, we'll do that. And that can be a really helpful tool just to kind of, and then hold that piece of paper, hold it and don't throw it out, because then you can, see what somebody else thought of you. Because sometimes that's what imposter syndrome is not just feeling like you may not be good enough, but also, your mind reading, which people can't read minds, but you mind read that everybody thinks that you're not good enough. So seeing that somebody else has written down the ways that you're good at your job or at, dragonfly, phylogeny, whatever it is, it can be a bit of an uplifting exercise.
Yeah, so similarly, imposter syndrome is really driven by being self-conscious about what you don't know, right? And that's actually a great thing. It's good to lack the hubris to think you know everything, right? And so you have to embrace that I'm anxious because I'm nervous that somebody's going to know more than me. And if somebody knows more than you, then just say oh, that's great. That's wonderful that you know that. And thank you for sharing it with me. You don't have to, you don't have to take on that you have to be the absolute best, the most informed person. And as Jessica mentioned, having your cheerleaders, my best friend from college, she gasses me up every day for no reason. I don't she sends me the most inspired, I don't know, she's this constantly positive person in my life. And because I can really beat myself up, I'm a master at that. And so having people who remind you that actually you work really hard and you do really, you do really good work. I mean, she's an accountant, so she doesn't know anything about insects, right? But it just reminds you how far you've come, as Jared mentioned, and that's a good thing. And, and making sure you do that for others too, right? Saying to your mentees or your mentors, or even the students in your class, if you're TAing, saying hey, you've been working really hard. You're doing such a good job. It really, everyone needs that. And especially during COVID, I've been working so hard during COVID to make sure people know, you're amazing. If you're looking at my face right now, you watching this right now, you're amazing. You're doing a great job, right? You're surviving. And that's right now, that's a pinnacle. So I'm so proud of you. So we need that. And we need that. Right, always, but especially right now. So just making sure you open that door to tell someone that you think that they're doing a good job.
Yeah, and I think you got a thank you in the chat for that one too. So somebody in the audience is definitely appreciative of that.
I'm glad we're recording this because I'm going to replay that little section whenever I'm feeling down. You watching this now, just remember.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess too, just kind of related to this, this past year, 2020, this really unprecedented year, we saw the injustices we saw this past year show that systemic racism is pervasive throughout our society. And it results in disparities between white and Black people in terms of health, wealth, education, et cetera. And so my question to you all is, how would you describe the impact of systemic racism on your academic and professional career?
Pulling out the big guns now, Morgan.
We're halfway through. We gotta ramp it up.
I would say it's, Alex, wouldn't you say it's part of everything? I mean, it's the system. We're functioning in the system. And the system was designed not necessarily for Jared, Alvin, Alexander, or I to be here on a panel as esteemed guests speaking about our science. So from kindergarten, from before, I mean, we've been given specific messages in commercials, TVs, movies, magazines, in our lectures, in the material that we have in our textbooks, in the way that people treat you when you're in your classes, in applying to graduate school and going and not seeing any Black people on the campus, going to your job interviews and not seeing any Black people for the entire day, going and being the first, always the first. There's a lot of ways that can be positive, as you know, at Jared, Alvin, Alexander, we've talked about. Those are things that can inspire you and can help, kind of motivate you to do things. But it also is an ever-present additional cost, I suppose, that we are paying.
Yeah, I definitely think that the realization sometimes when you wake up and you think about where you've come or what you've accomplished as any individual, all of us that are on this path to wherever we're heading in life, to recognize where you're coming from, but to realize, as Jessica is saying, that there is a suppressive system, and there's leaky pipelines, or there's just a pipeline that goes straight into the gutter. And I look at my family and my family members that I would see at a Thanksgiving or homecoming opportunity and realize how lucky I am to be out of it, and how many of them fall under all of the demographic numbers and percentages that they should be in. Like, it's exactly how many of my uncles are in jail, how many of my cousins don't have a father in the house, how many of them are struggling to get through high school or to go to, like, it's like, oh yeah, that's just the way that they're falling into the numbers, and I'm that small percentage. I think that the weird facet of that, though, is like, as the four of us up here as panelists experience, is that, and this is the weird kind of a paradox of it, is that we become this exceptional group. And being exceptional, being the one that, you know, every time I give a seminar, every time I'm invited to give a talk and I get to stand up, I feel as though I'm doing a disservice in one side of the story. Like, yeah, look at that. But I also wonder if some people have an internal dialogue that comes along with exceptionalism, is that, oh, all of the other people that are like you aren't here because they just didn't try hard enough, without recognizing there are systematic barriers that keep them from doing that. And I have to sometimes knock myself down a notch and say, like, I'm not special. I was just lucky to be at the right places at the right time. Luckily, my mother just moved down the block and out of the neighborhood and put me into a better school at that time, because otherwise I would have been in the same pipeline as so many others. And it means that there should be more people like me. I'm not special. There should be equity across sexes, genders, and races. So we should see equal distribution of that. But the fact that, like, the diminishing return and the diminishing numbers you see of people of our complexion or demographic in the academia really makes you realize, like, this is real. And what do I represent? And I think that I always kind of feel weird when I'm standing up and like, you're so good. Like, this is great. Just think about where you are. I'm like, yeah, but there's a system busting down so many more people like me. And that's the hard part to deal with, realizing what you are is this pseudo exceptionalist paradigm. But
I'll go next. Lots of challenges from growing up to where I am now. On the one hand, there are the negatives of people, negative behavior. And on the other hand, of all the positive support along the way. And throughout, I've really been focusing on the positives of all the hands that helped me along the way, the opportunities that were provided. And I guess if I really look back, I really wonder, why did I end up being successful? It could have been easily another path, like so many of my high school classmates that I knew growing up with. But there were so many opportunities that presented itself along the way, and so many individuals that had a genuine interest in helping me along the way. And that's one of the reasons that I try to help others, to provide opportunities for others across the board, so that things, as they grow older, can be more equitable than what they are for those individuals right now. It's quite a humbling experience to, as a graduate student, to receive a graduate presentation award in the branch level. I don't think I ever competed at the national level as a student. But that helped me at that time to say, yes, my efforts, what I thought were great, can be recognized. And then the respect for my colleagues was reinforced by being elected as president of the South Carolina Entomological Society, being elected as president of the Southeastern Branch ESA, and then being elected as president of ESA. Again, over 7,000 members, and which helps me to say, yes, there are lots of supporters out there. Then 2020, with the numerous social awareness that everyone around the world eyes began to open, and there were a number of texts and email communications on social media that was quite heartbreaking, quite frankly, of some of the comments, the negative comments of hearing our colleagues in the entomological community actually saying. And then some of those negative comments were conveyed directly to me as president of the ESA. And it's just really reading those things to say, colleagues, entomological colleagues, actually saying such comments and thoughts, which fortunately was counterbalanced by those positive comments that I was hearing about these same social issues. And so overall, it made it so much easier to be encouraged of focusing on the positives that are across the entomological community.
So I guess that leaves me last. I'm going to say, I feel very thankful and very lucky to be, have been, to not have been drugged down by all of the systemic things intentionally placed in my pathway. I grew up in a low-income area in Chicago, and there were so many places where I could have tripped up, right? And I managed to clear all of those hurdles. And so I'm really thankful, but no matter how thankful I am, I still live with the fear that I could have been Ahmaud Arbery. I love to run and I love to be out. I've been in neighborhoods where I feel like people are looking at me, like, where is she going? And I was like, I'm wearing like a tracksuit, like, all spandex. Like, what do you think I'm doing? But it could be me. And I live with that fear all the time, right? When you go into new spaces. And that does take a very significant toll on my work, right? Because you always are living with that in the back of your mind of, is somebody going to say something to me, or somebody going to do something to me? Even if I'm just trying to study insects. I did a lot of work in rural Missouri, and my husband, we ride down there, all my students are white, and they're looking at the Confederate flags, and they're like, are you going to be okay? And I'm like, I'm supposed to be in charge, right? And my white students are looking at me like, are you going to be okay? And I'm like, yeah, I think it's going to be okay. Sure. You guys just form a protective barrier around me. But so that is something that does impact the work of people in this field. And even when you have managed to get to a prestigious position, you aren't immune to those things happening to you, and so we have to remember that. And so one of the things, and so that means sometimes taking on additional burdens to make sure that people are better educated and better prepared. I teach a class on race in the environment, which is difficult. It's a lot of labor for me. It's very exhausting to have to lead hundreds of students through conversations about race. And I'm a biologist, but that's neither here nor there. But it needs to be done, because if people don't understand how systemic the problems are, the reason that the health of Black people is so poor is because of systemic problems in our society. This is not genetic. It's not, that people choose bad diets. This is systemic. It is intentional. And unless we actually deal with it and make people understand that it is systemic, that like the reason that there are high rates of asthma and cancer and other things in certain populations is because those people were placed there and kept there continuously. And we have to recognize that, and we have to like make sure that people learn about it and understand it. And that means that sometimes I have to do a lot more labor than I have energy for. And so sometimes I do just literally lay on the floor in my house, just like I'm just so tired of, it's very exhausting, like, remembering that I could be a mod and trying to help everybody else understand systemic racism and be a good scientist, right? Like, because ultimately that's what I am paid to do, is study bees. So that, that it's a pretty heavy tax to pay. But I hope that everyone is here because they want to be having those conversations and doing that work to understand people who don't look like you and lighten the burden that they carry, both when they walk around the streets and in their classrooms when they're trying to help encourage these conversations.
You bring up something. I want to follow up one thing with that. Like, there was a point this summer where I was jogging with my sons that I couldn't finish my run without crying at the end of it. One, running in a neighborhood that's well-to-do, where I'm the only Black human within, I don't even know how many mile radius in the space I live. That one, I'm running. My son saw 1 or 2 Black Lives Matter sign, trying to understand that, trying to tell him what that means, and then thinking about the headline I saw about a shooting of a man running, and then to the point that every run I came home crying, breaking down to my wife, and telling her, like, I just don't know how people could look at me and I'm a threat. I'm educating hundreds of their students a year. I'm paying taxes. I'm doing everything. I just want to be a being of love and accepted. And that someone could call the cops on me one time running down the street and I could be locked up or be hurt and never see my kids again. To the point that I didn't feel safe running without my children in a stroller. That I was using them almost as a shield. They're mixed race. It also shows that I'm not there to do anything bad when I have children with me. And they gave me this access to something that is a right to everyone else, that I feel like I have to ask and plead for acceptance just to exist. And that's taxing when you go into work after your morning jog and you cried and there's more headlines hitting you and your discussion topic is on, delphacids, or, you're talking about diphtheria today and bugs and that at the same edge of that story, I love studying these insignificant things and making them more significant to humans. There's a huge significant thing that gets marginalized every day in my existence, so I can go to work every day. And that burden I'm still coping with. That's something that's just inherent, and that it's the same thing. It puts this pressure, which isn't necessarily fair, but you're stuck in an unfair race anyway, that you get this duty. And more than ever this year, it's been pushed on me, and I've been trying to do more and more, but it's like, I'm realizing more and more that not just educating people and trying to speak to their morality and telling them, like, I'm human, which I've been doing, and I vocally try to say, like, we're all people, blood, bleed this. There needs to be power. There needs to be more power in the hands of the diverse community members. Like, because of this summer in 2020, I've been asked to be on hundreds of talks, panels throughout each college. Each part of the university looks for the few Black people, and they put us in a room, and we're talking to this panel of power, and none of the people that are in power look like us. And that's always my first problem. I was like, why did you call me into another meeting where I'm having all the same duties as all my other colleagues and peers that you're not calling to this room, to show me that I need to do something for you when you don't elect anyone that looks like me in the room to actually have power? And that's something that I'm trying to fight for more and more, looking at these rooms and spaces where there can be actually power to change policies. And I think advocating and telling people and speaking to people's morality is important to recognize we're all humans, but within the policy, there has to be power behind things, and there has to be more power given to the disadvantaged, marginalized groups.
And I would just add that I think one common refrain here, at least in the Northeast, was after 2020, we've had this global reckoning solved. It has not been solved, actually. In fact, many people who were suddenly aware that the civil rights movement in the 1960s hadn't solved all the problems were not people that look like us, because the people who look like us knew that the situation, we knew what the lay of the land was. And so I think that, you know, even we have this Black in Entomology Week happening this week, and people signed up and said, introduced themselves and did a roll call. And we had people tweeting at us, thank you to our white allies who addressed the tweet so we didn't have to. People were tweeting at us, why do you have to talk about race? Why make it about race? As if racism is over. But just because people were able to talk about it briefly in the summer, last summer, it has not solved the issues Jared's talking about. We need policy, we need advocacy, we need action.
Yeah, definitely. And the question I'm about to ask, I think some of you guys have already addressed some specific situations, but I'll go ahead and ask anyway. So a more subtle form of othering or exclusion is implicit bias, which is attitudes towards people or stereotypes associated with them without our conscious knowledge. Can you guys share any other instances where you experienced implicit bias and any actions you took to minimize its impact on your academic and professional career?
I've been told, I mean, it's so natural. It's in the lexicon of the American culture to just use bias on everyone. Whether I do it with my female students unknowingly, whether I do it with friends that are gay or trans, and practically I've done it. So we all do this, and this is what's important to realize. We all are racist to some extent. We all are sexist to some extent. We all are homophobic to some extent, because the world's been set up to a specific archetype. And basically, you know, if you don't fall within line, you know, I've had a more realization of this as a scientist, to be a member of society or whatever. Like, if I've become, at best case scenario, when I'm training my females in my lab, I'm training them to fit the white male model of a scientist. For a gay or trans member, they need to be the white male model, which has had all of these positions before, because that's what it's based on. And so that there are things within the system that those biases come out, and that you recognize it when you're in the room. And I've experienced things from either people telling me time and time. I've had institutions say, you know, it's no wonder you're going to leave eventually, you're Black and you only get jobs because you're Black. In bargaining, I've had multiple colleagues, when I notify them about a great opportunity for me, they assume the award was because I was Black. And they're like, oh, was that a Black award? Is that because you? And I'm like, what? This is a international award that anyone could be given. So there's an archetype in a model that we're all trying to defeat, and it defeats all of us. There is no model human, and not even a white male. It should fit a certain type of structure. They can be whoever they want to be. But there's this poster image you have when you think scientist. And whether it's in female studies when they've done this, or if you're thinking gender or you're thinking racial, there's an image that comes up. And because a lot of us, and no one actually fits the perfect image, you're going to experience it. And one way, unfortunately, you're trained to swallow it up, suck it up, and not say much when you hear a colleague say something slightly harmful to you. I've been practicing more to stand up and tell people that things are wrong. I'm much better at doing it when I'm advocating for another individual than I am for myself, because I've been trained to be tolerant and resistant. But if I see it happen to a colleague, I'm not usually a bystander, right? I'll stand out and shout. But doing it for yourself is challenging because you think you could sacrifice something you've gained by being quiet all these years.
I'd like to add that with not only in USDA, ARS, but also, quite frankly, universities across the board, there is less tolerance for bad behavior and things that people say. And within USDA, compare with when I first started with the agency, it's more encourage of people to report, to call out and to report such inappropriate behavior. And without being concerned with any reprisal along the way, which is a good thing. And of course, universities, there's that protection too. But we still know that unfortunately, things continue to happen. Behavior continues to be bad. And it's just incumbent of all of us to call it out when we see it.
I think one thing that can be hard is, depending on the career stage we're in, we might, like Jared was mentioning, internalize it rather than push back. Even if we know that there's policies, like what Alvin is mentioning, we may be afraid of reprisals, as he said. When I was in graduate school, the technician in my lab, stop me if you've heard the story before, but he told me in my first semester that Blacks and women were stealing all the grants and that I should drop out. He said, he didn't allude to it, he said the words. My advisor, said you should go and talk to him and make sure that you understood what he said. Maybe he didn't really mean that. So I went with I was married at the time, and I went with my husband, and he said it again. What to do? I decided to make a report, but I was so scared for the entire rest of my PhD that people viewed me differently, that they thought of me as a complainer. And in the end, years later, I found out that the report hadn't even been passed on. It stayed in the file 13, in a drawer somewhere. So maybe I hadn't needed to be worried at all that the deans would not like me. But I think that's something where we as mentors, and for those of us who do end up getting in charge of policy or have some of the power that Jared's talking about, we really need to kind of facilitate things, recognizing that with power differences, there are some people who are not going to be able to speak out and report things when there's implicit bias. And there needs to be clear, paths for mentors so that they can guide their mentees in the best way forward. Because I don't know that I got the best advice, even though my advisors were probably well-meaning.
I see we're almost out of time, but in the comments, a lot of people are wondering how they can be allies and how they can address these issues of systemic racism and implicit bias that we're seeing. And my one piece is to say, whenever you're in a position of power, there's so many different kinds of power. Right? As a professor, as a tenured professor, I have lots of power. If I'm on a hiring committee, I have lots of power. And so just remembering that when you're in those spaces, to be really thoughtful and use your power accordingly, right? And every university department has diversity statements. I stopped arguing with people about trying to make it personal, because they're like, oh, you're upset about this. And I said, no, this is our policy. Is that we're supposed to be diversifying our applicant pool. We're supposed to be diversifying our hiring. And if you use these back channels that you're talking about, we're not doing that. And then people were like, oh, I guess you're right. Like when you have a power and you have the, you know, the statements that everyone is making about how important these things are, how important it is for equity and inclusion to do these things, and you see things happening that do not align, right? Just say, like, I'm sorry. I started playing real dumb. I was like, I'm sorry. I'm really confused about how this is helping us address our like desire for increased equity at the university scale. I'm super confused. And then, you know, then they're like, you know, it's like they short circuit because they're like, oh, wait, she's holding us to the things we said we wanted. And so, but everyone has those exact statements available to them, and you can always bring them up because it is what they said they were trying to do. And if we at least start holding people to what they say they're trying to do consistently, and that means everybody, white, black, brown, orange, green, I don't care. If you have the statements, use them. Even the playing field, open the door, because when you open the door, you just have no, you know, make it a welcoming place for anybody to walk into.
I'd like to follow up on those bad actors. And as Jessica illustrated, that sometimes, yes, people let them go alone, let them go. But eventually, they will get caught and put in their place and dealt with accordingly, even though some incidents may, get by. And I tend to be quite optimistic that people like that eventually will get their due in time.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. Yeah, and I think that we are basically out of time for right now, and I definitely don't want to take up any more of your guys' time today. So maybe if anybody had any last minute thoughts or things that they wanted to share with the audience before we sign off, I'll leave it to you guys. But yeah, thank you so much again for sharing with us today. I really appreciate you all being here.
I just want to thank everyone again for being here, sharing this experience, and also on behalf of all the panelists, thanks for inviting us.
We have over 100 participants, and I'm really thankful that people want to hear about the challenge, like some of the challenges and how to do better and how to, you know, how to make entomology. I really believe entomology is for everyone, and you know, part of that is recognizing that the differences and the strengths that come with that diversity. And so thank you all so much for wanting to engage and wanting to hear from us. So thanks.
Following up on that, like, I think I say this sometimes about insects, and more of the talks I've been giving is that it's funny, as scientists that study bugs, we realize diversity is insects dominate that. And that we also take for granted this idea of diversity being functional when we're talking about ecosystems or species or diversity indices, how like the Shannon index means something. But in these spaces, we often impose diversity without knowing how to make it functional and experience it as a strength. And I think the more we can utilize diversity as a strength in the same way insects have done it to dominate this planet, we could realize that any institution, structure, boardroom, panel, the more diverse it is, the better it is for everyone. And so really understanding what functional diversity could mean for us as humans could be super powerful. And also read books. There's some good books. New Jim Crow, Anti-Racist, watch the movie, Picture a Scientist, read some good books and watch good documentaries to get educated on some of the facts.
I just want to say thank you also, like the rest of the panelists have said, thank you for organizing this, and thanks everyone for attending. And I guess I would just maybe to add my 2 cents would be that for the students of color in the audience, and really for everyone in the audience, there's a chance now, there's a lot more opportunity to find people who are doing this work than maybe when Alvin, Alex, Jared, or I were starting out. You know, there's with the tools that we have available to us through social media and otherwise, we can find each other, find like-minded people who are interested in making, who have shared values and who want to diversify our field. And so, there are ways to try and get involved. It's not too late. And if you feel like you're alone or you feel like you're the only one, you're not. We're here, and you can find us, and we can build a community together, I guess I would say. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all again so much. And Jessica, if you want to quickly maybe plug Black in Ento or any of the organizers for Black in Ento Week, we can definitely maybe do that really quick to end.
Super. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Black in Ento. We also have a website, Black in Ento. Alex was on a grad panel yesterday. The videos that we've recorded for the different panel events are on our YouTube channel, which is also Black in Ento. And the schedule is also available. So we've been trying to capture the breadth of the diversity that is in our field, and really celebrate all the different types of entomologists that are out there. And everybody is welcome. This is an event for everybody. So please join if you can. And if you missed the past events, like I said, you want to cook some cricket mac and cheese tonight, the recipe's on the YouTube channel, so check it out.
All right, great. Well, thank you all again. And I guess that we'll sign off for now. Bye, everyone. Thanks so much.